The morning sun stretched over the fields like a quiet promise. Its light didn't just touch the ground, it clung to it, like a prayer whispered through roots and bone. And at the edge of a worn wooden porch stood a woman, black, tall-backed, 74, with a cane in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. Her name was Ruth Grant, and though she said little, the land knew her weight. The soil had learned her steps. To the men in clean boots and polished trucks, she looked like history's afterthought, an old woman in overalls, guarding a piece of dying farmland. They didn't know they were standing on a battlefield. They didn't know she had fought in wars before, quiet wars, cold wars, wars where silence had a trigger and memory could aim straight. And they sure didn't know she hadn't lost a fight yet. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you look, if you've ever been told your time is done, that your name doesn't matter, that your story is just dust, this one's for you. Comment below where you're watching from and subscribe, because today we walk into the storm with Ruth Grant, and tomorrow we burn the whole playbook they used to silence women like her. That morning, Ruth noticed the tracks. Not animal, not hers. Just deep enough to say someone else had come through. Just faint enough to say they didn't want her to know. She sipped her coffee, didn't blink. Because if they were planning to take her land, they better come ready to bury more than just a fence post. The porch spoke before she did. It gave a low creak under her boots as Ruth Grant stepped outside, cane in hand, mug of coffee cradled in the other. The light hadn't yet lifted the mist off the fields, but the land was already whispering. She could hear it in the hush of leaves, the hush that wasn't silence but pause. A kind of listening, a kind of knowing. Ruth was 74. Her spine was straighter than the post of the gate, her breath steady, not because time had been gentle with her, but because she'd spent her whole life training her body to obey something deeper than pain discipline. She didn't flinch from discomfort, not in the joints, not in the soul. Before her stretched 68 acres of inheritance tilled, walked, bled into. It wasn't just land. It was proof. A place her husband, Tom, had once said was stitched to her bones. When the VA forgot his name, when the bank tried to forget their mortgage, when the town shrank its memory of who built what and where this land had remembered. And so had she. But that morning, something felt off. She saw it first near the north fence. A disturbance not obvious, not stupid, just enough to be noticed by someone who paid attention. The soil there looked ruffled, not by rain, not by deer, by weight, human weight. Someone had walked that line, someone who thought they were invisible. Then the air, sharp, carried a chemical note, faint but wrong. Ruth had grown up knowing the smell of gun oil, diesel, broken copper pipes. This wasn't any of those, but it wasn't natural either. She didn't curse, didn't call anyone, didn't Google. She just went inside, flipped open the old map Tom had drawn by hand, the one he kept under the floorboards for 20 years. She traced her finger along the ridge marked unstable in his sharp cursive. His warnings had once felt like paranoia. Now they felt like scripture. Ruth sipped her coffee, eyes on the horizon. "They're testing the edges," she murmured. Not to anyone, just to the wind. Because it had always carried things to her before men ever did. The first truck showed up 3 days later. It didn't roar. It glided like it knew it didn't need to announce itself. Clean white paint, tinted windows, tires too polished for gravel roads. Ruth watched from the porch, her coffee untouched. The air around her didn't move. Even the birds had gone still. A man stepped out. Early 40s, white. The kind of clean-shaven that wasn't about hygiene, it was about control. He wore a button-down shirt rolled to the elbows, sleeves cuffed just enough to suggest he was one of the good ones. Casual, confident, calculated. "Miss Grant," he asked, smiling like he'd rehearsed. Ruth didn't answer. He walked closer, slow and smooth, holding an envelope between 2 fingers like it was a gift instead of a warning. Name's Eric Stone. I work with a development group focused on rural revitalization. We heard about your property. Beautiful stretch of land. Historic even. My team wants to make you an offer that honors your legacy." Ruth raised an eyebrow. Didn't invite him to sit. Didn't offer coffee. Her silence stretched long enough to turn his smile brittle. He went on. "You've done more than most could. Held this place down for decades. But the world's changing fast. This land's got more under it than soil. Could be your golden chapter. Miss Grant. One signature. And you could spend the rest of your years without the weight of upkeep." She looked at the envelope, then at him. And finally, she spoke. "I don't carry weight," she said. "I carry memory." He chuckled too loud, too bright. Sure. Just take a look. Think it over." He set the envelope gently on the railing beside her, like it was holy. Ruth didn't touch it. Not then. She waited until he left, tires spinning up a cloud of red dust, before she picked it up with 2 fingers like it might burn. Because in a way, it already had. That evening, the sky turned the color of burnt copper. The sun dipped behind the ridge like it was hiding something, and the cicadas took over the silence with their dry, rhythmic chant. Ruth sat on the edge of the porch, the envelope in her lap like a sleeping snake. She hadn't opened it not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because she already knew. Offers like that never came clean. She remembered this kind of pitch from years ago. Different men in different suits, always calling her ma'am, always pretending like legacy was something they cared about, always using words like freedom and choice when they really meant compliance. She ran a thumb along the gold-embossed edge of the flap. It shimmered in the last light like something sacred. But Ruth had never mistaken shine for substance. She opened it. The number inside was big, bigger than she expected. A lifetime's worth of money in bold print taxes accounted for, relocation stipend included, even a line about assisting with heritage preservation. She let the paper rest on her knees, stared out at the pecan trees swaying gently in the twilight. This land had held her marriage, her grief, her sweat. Her late husband's ashes were buried beneath the cottonwoods. It wasn't valuable because of what was under it. It was valuable because of what had already happened on it. She stood up slow. Her knees ached, but her spine didn't bend. With quiet precision, she walked inside, opened the old iron stove, and fed the paper into the fire, watched it curl, blacken, and collapse into ash. Not with anger, not with fear, with intention. Because in Ruth Grant's world, burning an offer wasn't about rejecting a deal. It was about drawing a line no man could step over without consequence. The fire crackled once, then went still. By morning, the ash had cooled. But the war had begun. The town didn't change overnight. It shifted the way soil does after a long drought, quietly, invisibly, until the cracks show. Ruth noticed it first at the feed store. The clerk young, thin, the kind who called every man sir but never called her anything, bagged her grain without a word. No eye contact, no small talk about the weather or the price of hay. Just the kind of mechanical politeness that said, "I don't see you anymore." Later that day, she passed the sheriff's office on Main. Sheriff Cole stood outside, thumbs tucked into his belt, talking to a man in a blue blazer too clean for a town with real work. When Ruth walked by, both stopped speaking. The man glanced at her, then quickly away. Cole, for his part, offered a nod so slight it could have been a twitch. No one said anything. That was the thing. Not a word of disapproval. Not a whisper of threat. Just a silence that tightened, day by day, like a noose braided from polite distance. The next Sunday, she sat alone in the back pew at church. Not her usual seat. Her seat had been taken by a woman from the new subdivision, who smiled at her without really looking. The pastor's sermon was about letting go when seasons shift, and Ruth didn't miss the way his eyes kept drifting toward her like he was asking her to take the hint. But Ruth had never taken a hint in her life. Not when they told her she was too old to serve. Not when they said women couldn't wear the badge. And sure as hell not when they acted like her name didn't belong on a deed that had survived more battles than any of them had ever fought. She left before the final hymn, stepped out into the crisp fall air with her coat wrapped tight and her jaw tighter. Because now she knew. The trucks weren't just circling her land. They were circling her life. The first cut came quiet. It was the front driver's side tire on her truck. Slashed not deep enough to deflate immediately, but just enough to give out if she took the highway curve at over 40. The kind of sabotage meant to look like a coincidence, meant to send a message without an envelope. Ruth found it early, just after dawn, when the ground was still soft with night moisture. She crouched beside the wheel and examined the gash. Clean, precise, not an accident. Boot prints lingered in the dirt nearby. Not fresh, but not yet erased. Someone had dragged a branch through them, thinking that was enough. Amateurs. She didn't curse, didn't shout. She changed the tire, wiped her hands on her jeans, and made a small mark in the red ledger on her kitchen counter, the same one Tom had used to track rainfall and harvest losses. She added a new column. Incursions. Beneath it date, location, pattern, response. The second warning came 2 nights later. A water pipe burst near the barn. At first, she thought it was aged copper lines laid back when Jimmy Carter was still on TV. But when she pulled the joint, she found the cut was too clean, like it had been snipped with bolt cutters. No corrosion, no wear, just intent. Ruth boiled rainwater that night, drank it slow. As she sipped, she checked the locks on every door and window, remeasured the tension in the cellar hatch, and made a quiet inventory of the weapons she hadn't touched in over 10 years. She didn't go looking for a fight, but she also didn't pretend she couldn't still win one. And when the third sign came, her oldest goat stiff and bloated near the north fence, foam at the mouth, poison in her veins, Ruth didn't cry. She buried the animal by hand. No stone, no words. Just dirt, and a silence heavy enough to feel like thunder. She went down into the cellar just after dusk. The light from the pantry cast a soft glow over the concrete steps, but Ruth didn't need to see to find her way. Her hand traced the rail by memory, her boots landing on each tread with a rhythm that had long ago become instinct. At the far end of the cellar, behind the shelves of preserves and emergency feed, sat a cabinet with a rusted latch. It hadn't been opened in 12 years, not since Tom's funeral. She unlocked it with a small key that never left her necklace. Inside oiled cloth, steel, and silence. Her sniper rifle lay exactly where it had always been, wrapped tight, scope detached but polished, magazine stored beside it. Ruth peeled back the cloth the way someone might open an old letter slow, reverent, final. She ran her fingers over the woodstock. It was smooth and cool, like something still alive. She tested the trigger pressure, checked the sights, disassembled and reassembled it without looking. Not because she was preparing for violence, but because muscle memory doesn't lie. Next came the sidearm, smaller, but no less familiar. The holster clicked into place inside her waistband like it had been waiting all these years to come home. When she finally stepped back onto the porch, the wind had picked up. The cicadas had gone quiet. In the distance, the gravel road lay still, but something in the air had shifted. Not fear. Not yet. But readiness. She looked out across the field where her goat had died, eyes sharp, breath steady. That part of her, the part trained to kill in silence, to vanish between trees, to hit targets from 6 football fields away. That part was awake now. And Ruth Grant had never been the kind of woman to wake something she didn't plan to use. The next morning, Ruth walked her land. But not as a farmer. As a soldier. The cane was gone. In its place, a carpenter's chalk line, a worn tape measure, and a field notebook with weathered corners. She moved with deliberate pace, slow but precise, pausing often to kneel, to touch the earth, to feel for what others might miss. Every tree was a potential blind, every fence line, a possible choke point, every hill, an elevation worth noting. She mapped the terrain like she was building a fortress not from wood, but from angles and line of sight. She plotted distances from her house to the back pasture, marked shadow pockets where intruders could hide, identified fallback zones should she need to shift position in the dark. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. She had done this before in places far from this soil, where the ground was sand and the air thick with heat and history. She had learned there that defense didn't start with a weapon. It started with a plan. By noon, she'd installed the first set of tripwires, thin copper lines strung ankle-high through the eastern grove, hidden beneath dry grass. At the far end, she wired them to repurposed radio switches, buried beneath overturned feed buckets. If tripped, they wouldn't ring. They'd vibrate just enough to shake a pressure sensor bolted to the floor of her kitchen. Not a sound, not a flash, just a whisper through wood. That night, she slept on the couch, boots on, rifle within reach. No lights, no television. Just the sound of wind brushing the side of the house, and the steady rhythm of her own breath. She wasn't scared. Fear was what they were counting on. But Ruth Grant didn't shake anymore. She listened, and she waited. Because if they came again next time, she'd be the one watching first. Over the next 2 days, Ruth became a shadow among her own fields. She moved early, before the dew dried, when the air still held the night's silence. At the edge of the west pasture, she marked off a second set of tripwires this time, looped through old feed troughs and anchored by what looked like broken fence posts. To anyone else, it was just disrepair. To her, it was a warning line. She reinforced the barn from the inside, not with new wood or steel beams, but with anticipation. Doors were braced, windows draped in thick blackout cloth she stitched herself, each corner weighted with sand. A lantern hung low from the ceiling, its flame barely flickering when she walked past, casting just enough light to reveal the shapes of the tools she'd laid out with precision. No theatrics, just readiness. In the kitchen, she rearranged the floorboards beneath the pantry, cleared a crawl space that hadn't been used since her husband's funeral. There she placed an emergency backup, her secondary rifle, 3 sealed bottles of rainwater, a shortwave radio, and a knife so old the handle bore her initials scratched in by Tom when they were young and stupid and still believed in safe retirements. Outside, she dug shallow trenches through the garden rows, not to plant, but to move, low, covered paths, marked only in her memory, leading from the front porch to the irrigation tank and the old willow. From those points, she could see nearly every inch of the property without being seen. And still, the town said nothing. No more trucks came, no more polite smiles. Just the quiet kind of danger that builds when bad men think they have time. She hadn't set her traps to scare them off. She'd set them because she knew they'd be back. And when they came next, it wouldn't be for talking. It wasn't just her land they were after. It was her name. That morning, Ruth drove to the courthouse in the next county over 45 minutes on cracked asphalt, passing hayfields and rusted mailboxes. The kind of quiet stretch where nothing moved unless you knew what to look for. She didn't go to the main desk, didn't waste time with small-town clerks who'd already turned cold. Instead, she walked straight to the records window with a manila folder under her arm, papers she'd been collecting for months. Mineral rights claims, topographic maps, copies of the surveys her husband had hidden before he died. Legal filings notarized by a lawyer 3 towns away, one who owed her favors and kept his mouth shut. The clerk behind the glass, Derek, it said on his tag, looked up with disinterest, then did a double-take. Like he hadn't expected someone like her. He took the folder like it was heavy, even though it wasn't. Older filings are a pain to index, he muttered, already tapping keys too fast to be accurate. Ruth said nothing. She just watched. When the final confirmation screen flashed, she saw his eyes flick quick, sharp toward the hallway that led to the sheriff's office. He slipped a phone from beneath the desk, typed something with his thumb, then handed her a stamped receipt without a smile. She took it, turned, and walked out into the sunlight. Behind her, a message had been sent. She didn't know to whom, but she knew what it meant. The silence around her wasn't just indifference anymore. It was coordination. Back at the farm, she opened her notebook and made a new entry. They know I filed. They're coming next. And that night, as the wind shifted through the trees like breath through a rifle barrel, she reached for a radio she hadn't touched in years and called a voice she'd left behind in another war. "Ray," she said, "I need eyes in the trees." Ray Hill answered on the third ring. His voice came through the line like bourbon over gravel low, familiar and rough at the edges. "You calling means they made their move," he said. "No hello. No small talk." "They haven't stepped through the gate yet," Ruth replied. "But the soil's cracking, and someone's been watching my ridgeline at night." Ray exhaled through his nose. She could hear him shift in his chair, leather creaking, paper rustling. Probably still living in that busted trailer outside of Monroe, the one with 2 satellite dishes and a backup generator older than both of them. "You need recon," he asked. 4 square miles. I want satellite heat pulls, recent pathing, and I want to know what kind of boots they're wearing. I'll tap into NOAA backfeed. Might take 12 hours. 12's fine," she said. "But make it clean. If they're watching me, they're watching my roots too." There was a pause. Not long, just enough. "You alone, Ruth?" "I'm enough." He didn't argue. He never had. That was part of the code. The men they used to work with most had died, retired, or disappeared. But the ones who were left knew better than to insult a woman who could outshoot half their unit. "I'll send you a drop link," Ray said. "Scrambled through Nevada Relay. You'll have it before sunrise." Ruth hung up without a goodbye. The wind outside had thickened. Not storm thick, but intentional. The kind of stillness that came before something broke. She set the receiver down, reached for a laminated map tucked behind her kitchen cabinet, and traced her finger along the red lines Tom had once drawn fallback points. Range vectors. Elevation shifts no one else ever saw. Then she slid the chair back, walked to the barn, and began preparing the other nest. Because if they came tonight, they wouldn't be the only ones with a plan. Ruth moved through the house like someone dusting off a memory. She opened the drawer beneath the hallway mirror and pulled out an old tin key green paint-chipped loop tied with faded thread. She hadn't used it in nearly a decade, but her fingers remembered the weight, the way it used to swing from Tom's belt loop when he walked the fields just after rain. The key fit into the floorboard under the writing desk. With a low click, the board lifted, revealing a shallow cavity lined with oilcloth. Inside a hard drive, an envelope of photographs, and a folded canvas map edged with grease and age. She laid the map flat on the table. Tom's handwriting was small, tight, methodical. It always had been. The red pencil slashes weren't just markings, they were code. Observations, angles of fire, soil weakness zones, drone signatures from a flyover he'd commissioned without telling her. The man had seen this day coming long before she had. And now, the past was her best weapon. She turned to the hard drive. No labels, no stickers, just matte black plastic and the hum of encrypted purpose. She connected it to her field laptop, not the everyday one she used for taxes and seed orders, but the old unit. Military issue. No camera, no Bluetooth, just code and clarity. Just code and... Folders popped up one by one. Local corruption patterns, land transfer timelines, unknown LLCs, cross-match with sheriff, registrar delay matrix. Ruth's lips pressed into a thin line. They hadn't just wanted her land. They'd been buying up everything around her. Quietly. Legally. Through a network of names she'd never seen, but Tom had. She copied the files to 3 encrypted thumb drives. One she'd bury. One she'd mail. And one she'd keep around her neck, like a second kind of dog tag. By the time she stood, the light outside had dipped orange against the barn. The wind had stilled again. Like it, too. Was waiting. But Ruth wasn't. She was already 2 steps ahead. She found the first scout cam just before sundown. It was tucked high in a sycamore tree near the east slope, disguised beneath a fake knot carved into the bark. Clever, but not clever enough for someone who used to spot snipers through heat shimmer in Kandahar. She climbed slowly, careful not to snap any branches. Her shoulder ached, old injury, still loyal, but her grip was steady. At the top, she pried the unit loose and studied it on the tailgate of her truck. Compact, high grade, no consumer junk here. Someone had invested real money in watching her. She didn't smash it, not yet. She unscrewed the casing, clipped the transmitter, and rerouted its feed through a signal loop. 2 days' worth of footage her land calm. Untouched, now played on repeat. If they were watching, they'd be watching the wrong version of the truth. The second cam took longer to find. Buried in the knot of an old hickory tree near the dry creek bed. This one she left untouched, but added a subtle detail in front of it, a broken shovel, a turned-over feed bucket, something to make them think she wasn't aware. Let them underestimate her. Let them believe their advantage held. Inside the barn, she tested the vibration sensors, the tripwire alarms, and the silent signal relay Ray had mailed her years ago, disguised inside a box of dehydrated peaches. Each unit lit up green. The house was wired. The perimeter watched. The traps were live. By the time night fell, Ruth stood on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes trained toward the tree line. Not with panic, not with rage. With rhythm. This wasn't fear. This was formation. She'd worn uniforms for men who didn't know her name. Now, she was fighting for land that did. And if they came tonight, she wouldn't be the one caught off guard. The trucks came just after midnight. No headlights, no engines roaring, just the hush of heavy tires rolling slow over gravel like whispers through bone. Ruth felt the vibration before she saw the shape her floorboard trembled once. Then again, a steady rhythm just under the skin of the house. She didn't reach for the phone. There was no one to call. She reached for the rifle. Outside, the moon hung low, dull, bruised yellow, casting long shadows across the pasture. From the silo, her highest perch. She could see them, 3 vehicles, matte black, formation tight, too polished for locals. They weren't here to talk. They were here to finish. 8 men dismounted, 2 from each side, 2 hanging back, gear strapped to their backs, suppressors on the rifles, tactical gloves, movements too smooth for hired muscle. They moved like men trained to take orders, but not to ask questions. Ruth exhaled once. The cold metal of the rifle pressed against her cheek like an old friend. She adjusted the scope, sighted in on the lead man. He scanned the tree line, didn't look up. First mistake. She fired. The sound was soft, suppressed, surgical. The bullet entered his chest just beneath the collarbone. He dropped before the echo could bounce. The others froze, looked around, confused. She shifted positions, belly to wood, crawling backward like smoke through the grain. At her second nest, 20 yards south, she loaded the next round. The second shot clipped another in the thigh. He went down screaming, panic cracking the stillness. "Sniper," someone shouted. Too late. The word itself made her smile, a tight, grim curl. It wasn't pride. It was recognition. She slid to her third nest, settled in, and aimed again. Let them scatter. Let them run. Ruth Grant didn't need numbers. She needed distance, wind, and truth. And all 3 were on her side tonight. They didn't know the land. That was their second mistake. The moment they scattered, the formation broke. One ran toward the north fence, tripped the copper wire, and took a homemade spike through the calf. Another bolted left, straight through the vegetable rows, not realizing Ruth had flooded the trench line 2 days earlier. He slipped, rolled, and vanished into mud. Panic travels faster than bullets. From her third perch, Ruth watched them turn on each other with confusion. No clear orders. No chain of command. Just adrenaline, and the creeping realization that they were being hunted. She lowered her rifle, changed elevation, and looped around through the east tree line. Her boots made no sound, just soft impressions in the pine needles. Every movement was deliberate, slow, perfectly timed. She found one of them crouched behind her water tank, trying to radio. No visual, no origin, just downed men. Repeat, just downed men. Something's wrong. She didn't shoot him. Not yet. She crept up behind the tank, let her shadow fall across his hands. He turned too late. The barrel of her sidearm met the back of his skull with a dull thunk, and he dropped like wet cloth. 3 down, 5 remaining. They'd stopped shouting orders. Now, they whispered. One called the others by name. Drew, Silas, Vince. Fall back. Regroup at Point Charlie. Point Charlie. Ruth smirked. This wasn't a military op. This was a rehearsal gone live. She climbed the ladder inside the barn, took up the high window. From here, she could see the driveway, the exit path. 2 of them were running toward the trucks, dragging one wounded. The driver started the ignition. She fired once. The engine block sparked, hissed, died. She didn't fire again. Let them sit in the dark. Let them taste helplessness. This was no longer about land. This was about memory. And tonight, they were guests in hers. The wind shifted just after 2 a.m. Not enough to stir the trees, just enough to lift the scent of gun oil, blood, and fear into the night air. Ruth stood at the edge of the field, her silhouette framed by the barn's broken window light, a rifle slung low across her shoulder. They were crawling back now, 2 of them dragging a third, limping, bleeding, confused. No more formation, no more call signs, no more swagger. They didn't see her until she stepped forward, boots crushing dried grass, cane tapping once against the earth. She didn't need the cane. She brought it for punctuation. One of the men froze, raising his hands instinctively, not from surrender, but because something in her eyes told him this was not the fight he thought he came for. "You done?" she asked. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't echo, but it cut through the night like a blade slipped beneath bone. The tallest of them, broad-chested, sleeve rolled with a faded tattoo, gritted his teeth. "You don't know who we work for." She tilted her head, almost curious. "You think I care?" He stepped forward, trying to puff up. "This land's not worth dying for." Ruth's eyes didn't blink. Her face didn't flinch. "That's where you're wrong." She gestured slowly, with the tip of her cane, toward the house, the fields, the willow tree near the fence line. "You stepped on something you can't buy. You crossed into something older than your paychecks and cleaner than your conscience." She paused. "Let the silence do the rest." "Then you're still breathing because I said so." No one moved. No one answered. She turned her back on them and walked toward the porch, each step an erasure of their arrogance. And as the wind picked up behind her, it didn't carry their names. It carried hers. Ruth Grant. And now they knew it. By morning, the house smelled like gun oil and boiled coffee. The sun had barely crested the ridge, but Ruth was already at the kitchen table. Maps unfolded, laptop humming low. The burn on her shoulder from the night before had stiffened, but she'd cleaned it with iodine and wrapped it tight. Pain was nothing new. What mattered now was the data. Ray's drop link arrived just after 6:17 a.m., hidden in a scrambled email titled Garden Soil Tips, Autumn. She decrypted the file with a series of passcodes she hadn't used since she was 41. Her fingers didn't hesitate. Each keystroke felt like a breath returning. What unfolded on screen wasn't theory. It was confirmation. Drone footage, movement logs, satellite pings, license plate registries, heat trail clusters around the North Ridge. But more than that, corporate filings. Shell companies. LLCs with vague names like Horizon Field Group, Blackstone Agricultural Futures, Morning Delta Holdings, all filed from out of state, all set to trigger automatic claims on unregistered mineral rights, including hers, if her paperwork had been delayed by even 10 days. They'd built a system to erase people like her quietly, legally, profitably. But Ruth had filed just in time, barely, and now she had proof they tried to block it. She opened the folder marked Registrar Delay Matrix, a spreadsheet overlay that showed her submission timestamp, the logged interference by Clerk Derek W., and cross-referenced email threads from the sheriff's office. She didn't need a lawyer to tell her what this was. Conspiracy, collusion, fraud. But she needed someone who could make it stick. She picked up the old flip phone she kept in the pantry drawer, the one without GPS, never connected to Wi-Fi. She dialed a number she hadn't used in over a decade. It rang twice. A woman answered, sharp voice, calm, young. Leah Knox, Environmental Land Justice Legal Network. Ruth said only 5 words. You've been tracking my land. There was a pause on the line. Not long. Just enough for Ruth to hear the click of a keyboard, the shift in breath as Leah Knox sat up straighter on the other end. Franklin County, Leah said. 72 acres. Mineral claim filed under the name Ruth Grant. Delayed processing. Signature mismatch flagged last week. Ruth blinked once. You already pulled it? She said. I've been watching that parcel for months, Leah replied. Yours was the only filing that didn't vanish. Ruth nodded to herself. Of course. The girl had eyes. They came for me last night, Ruth said simply. Leah's voice tightened, like piano wire. Did you defend it? Yes. Did you record it? Ruth's hand moved to the thumb drive around her neck, every frame. Another pause, then a tone shift. Not disbelief engagement. You have documentation. 3 audio files, 2 recovered cameras, 1 registered attempt to bypass mineral rights by a false LLC tied to a sheriff's office, and a man named Eric Stone who offered me a number with too many zeros and not enough honesty. I know that name, Leah said. I know the angle, Ruth replied. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was strategy being born. Ruth could almost feel Leah's mind stitching pieces together from hundreds of cases across counties and states. Not rage. Clarity. You still have the originals? 3 backups, 1 buried, 1 mailed, 1 with me. Good, Leah said. Here's what we're going to do. In that moment, Ruth heard it not youth, not naivete, but conviction wrapped in law. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the only one standing at the fence line. She was joined by a woman younger than her scars, but just as dangerous. 2 women, 2 timelines, 1 war, and now it was going public. They stayed on the call for over an hour. Not chit-chat, not comfort, planning. Leah moved like someone who didn't have time for outrage-only execution. Ruth laid out every document she had: satellite overlays, transfer filings, timestamp mismatches, video stills. Leah pulled up her own archive, a web of fraudulent land acquisitions stretching across 3 counties, all marked by sudden property transfers, delayed mineral claims, and the same trail of corporate shells. This isn't just your land, Leah said. It's a pattern. You're the only one who survived it long enough to name names. Ruth leaned back in her chair, staring out the window where the sun now carved long amber lines through the porch rail. Then let's name them. They agreed on the steps. Emergency injunction to freeze any transfer or development on her land. Press leak through a quiet contact at the Southern Ledger, a small investigative outfit known for chasing down land corruption stories the bigger outlets ignored. Filing for whistleblower protection, using Ruth's documentation and the audio recordings as evidence of systemic conspiracy and attempted land seizure through coordinated fraud. And finally, a civil RICO suit against the local sheriff, county registrar, and 3 named LLCs, all tied by timestamp, email, and physical presence on Ruth's land. Leah didn't flinch at the scale. We'll go federal. Once we trigger a wire fraud angle, they won't be able to hide behind county shields. Ruth nodded. There was something ruthless in the quiet between them. Something clean. Not vengeance. Precision. Before they hung up, Ruth asked, "Why are you doing this?" Leah's voice softened only slightly. "Because I watched my aunt lose her land 10 years ago. Same pattern. No cameras. No fight left in her. They took everything but her name. I've been waiting for someone who had both. Ruth didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just looked at the drive in her hand, then slid it into the padded envelope on the table. The first bullet had already been fired. But this was the one with their names on it. The first shift wasn't in the courthouse. It was in the town. 3 days after Leah filed the emergency injunction, something changed in the way people looked at Ruth. Not the usual avoidance, not the orchestrated coldness that had crept in since the trucks came. No, this was different, a tight-lipped uncertainty, like they weren't sure who knew what anymore. At the feed store, the new clerk bagged her salt blocks and looked her in the eye. Didn't say anything, but didn't look away either. At the gas station, a man in a suit stood too long near pump 4, his Bluetooth still blinking. When Ruth stepped out of her truck, he got in his car and left without filling up. Something was unraveling, and it wasn't coming from Ruth's side. That night, she received an encrypted message from Leah. The story's going live at midnight. No bylines, no photographs, just documents, video stills, audio excerpts, and a name. Sheriff Aaron Cole linked to 6 land seizures in 3 counties, all involving minority-owned property, all tied to the same web of shadow companies. Another name, Eric Stone, listed as development liaison in over a dozen LLCs that existed only on paper, many of them filed by the same notary in the same office that had once lost Ruth's paperwork. The article didn't accuse. It exposed. By morning, the phones at the sheriff's office stopped being answered. The county registrar's window was closed for staffing issues, and 2 of the trucks that had parked across Ruth's road in past weeks didn't come back. The reckoning hadn't landed yet, but the ground was already cracking. And Ruth. She watered her collards in silence, boots firm in the soil. Let the headlines roll. She had seeds to plant. The subpoenas landed on a Thursday. No warning, no headlines, just sealed manila envelopes delivered by federal courier to 7 addresses across 3 counties. One was sent to the downtown office of Southern Future Ventures, a real estate shell registered under a borrowed P.O. box. Another arrived at the home of a sitting member of the State Energy Commission, delivered while he was at a charity luncheon hosted by the very firms now under investigation. The trigger, Ruth's evidence. Leah had filed the RICO brief under the Whistleblower Land Security Act, an obscure provision rarely used, but still written in federal code. It connected the land seizures across counties not as isolated events, but as a pattern of organized racketeering. They didn't come with guns. They came with math, geotagged data, matched transfer timelines, duplicated IP addresses, one video still of Eric Stone standing near Sheriff Cole's SUV during what was supposed to be a routine inspection of a condemned tract 2 weeks before the claim was filed. It was the kind of trail only someone who had been watching from the shadows could follow. And Ruth. She didn't even need to leave the farm. Leah handled it all from Atlanta, her office a blur of legal assistants, case folders, and heat maps taped across whiteboards. Her phone never stopped blinking. Whistleblowers came out of hiding. A junior clerk from another county emailed her a scanned invoice showing a forged notary signature on Ruth's delay form. The machine was cracking from the inside. By the time the local news caught up, the federal agents were already 2 steps in, sifting through servers, unsealing warrants, copying hard drives into evidence bins. No one had expected the collapse to come from a farm. And certainly not from a woman who still used paper ledgers and rotary locks. But Ruth hadn't needed modern tools. She had memory, timing, and proof. The system had bet on her dying before her land mattered. It had bet wrong. They brought him to the barn just after dusk. Not Ruth, the agents. 2 federal officers in plain clothes. Polite but firm. No cuffs yet. Just an escort. A conversation. They said, for clarity, for confirmation. But Ruth knew what it was. It was exposure. Eric Stone looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He still wore the expensive coat. Still had that gleaming hairline like he'd just stepped out of a campaign ad. But something in the shoulders had folded. His spine was no longer selling confidence. It was holding up regret. He stepped inside the barn and paused. Maybe it was the smell cedar, dust, rope. Maybe it was the sight of the camera mounted in the rafters, red light blinking steady. Or maybe it was the silence, the kind that had buried men in softer places than this. Ruth didn't stand to greet him. She sat at the folding table, ledger closed, thumb drive sitting beside a chipped mug of black coffee. "You remember this place," she said. Eric nodded, swallowed. "I didn't think they'd connect me to all of it." Ruth tilted her head. "They didn't. You did." He blinked. She didn't let him speak. "You walked onto my porch thinking I didn't know what silence could hold. You smiled like I was a relic, like land stops meaning something when the body holding it turns gray." He looked down. She pressed on, calm, steady. "You offered me a future that cost me my past." She slid a single page across the table. It was his signature. On a transfer document tied to a company registered the day before her mineral rights were delayed. "You want to cooperate now?" she asked. "Or wait until the other names start talking first?" Eric looked at the document, and then, slowly, nodded. "I'll talk." Ruth leaned back in her chair, the wood creaking beneath her like an exhale. "Good," she said. "Then let's start with the sheriff." By the time the indictments were unsealed, Ruth was planting kale. Not because she didn't care, because she already knew. Leah had sent the message at 6:42 a.m. sharp. Federal charges filed, 3 resignations, 1 surrender attempt. Stone's confession confirmed 17 cross-count references. They're naming names now. Ruth didn't smile. She pressed her thumb into the soil, firm but not harsh. The dirt gave the way it always had, not because it was weak, but because it understood pressure. Later that morning, 2 black SUVs rolled past the edge of her field. Slow, federal, no sirens, just movement with purpose. One turned off at the county records office, the other headed toward the sheriff's compound. Sheriff Cole didn't see it coming. He was in uniform when they arrived, still wearing the badge, still believing silence could be bought with time. But when the agent stepped inside and handed him the warrant, there was no anger, no fight. Just the sag of a man who thought the story had ended before her name was ever spoken out loud. He went without struggle, because he knew. There were cameras now. There were timestamps. There was a woman who remembered. At the registrar's office, the clerk who had misplaced Ruth's filings had already packed up his desk. His resignation letter cited family reasons, but the paper trail didn't care why he left. It only cared that he signed off on 5 property holds that never reached the state database. By noon, local news anchors were stuttering through statements. By dusk, the Southern Ledger had published a full interactive timeline called The Erasure Map: How Rural Black Landowners Were Targeted by Title Manipulation Across 3 States. At the center of it, one red dot. Ruth Grant's farm. She didn't watch the segment. She didn't repost the article. She sat on the porch with a cup of hot chicory and whispered into the wind. They know now. The porch boards were warm beneath her feet. Spring had come late that year. The wind still bit at dawn, but by mid-morning it carried the scent of new grass and sun-warmed pecan bark. Ruth stood at the edge of her front steps, a burlap sack in one hand, her cane in the other. Not the same cane as before. This one was carved from willow, hand-smoothed by a veteran from Louisiana who'd come up to help rebuild the shed. He didn't speak much, just handed her the cane and said, "It bends before it breaks, like you." Ruth used it when she walked the fields now, not for support, but for communion. She tapped it gently against fence posts as she passed. A rhythm the land had learned to follow. Bullet, her dog, ran wide arcs ahead of her, his paws stirring up clouds of dry pollen and scattered memories. The west garden had sprouted early. Rows of collards, kale, sweet onions, no machines, just hand-tended soil, tilled with slow reverence. A handful of volunteers came every weekend, young veterans, a few neighbors, a church group from 2 counties over. No one asked questions. No one made speeches. They just showed up with gloves and trowels, knowing something sacred had happened here. Leah visited once a month now, always on a Sunday, always with a box of fresh documents and a tin of cornbread. They sat on the porch and didn't talk about the past unless the breeze asked them to. Instead, they planned. The King Land Trust had filed its first 5 acquisitions, all black-owned farms at risk of seizure, all now protected under federal watch. No marketing, no gala, just paperwork, just permanence. Ruth never signed with a flourish, only with intention. Because survival wasn't about press conferences. It was about ownership without explanation. And as she dropped the first seed into the hole she'd carved by hand, she whispered, not a prayer, but a fact. This land remembers who stayed. She buried the last flash drive beneath the sugar maple, the one closest to the north fence where the goats used to graze, where the footprints had first appeared. The dirt there had always been a little darker, a little denser, the kind of soil that kept secrets but never lost them. No headstone, no plaque, just the weight of her hand pressing it down. Above her, the maple leaves swayed without sound. Somewhere beyond the pasture, another truck passed along the highway unmarked, uninterested. The world had moved on. But Ruth hadn't. Because this land hadn't. She walked back to the house in the rhythm of someone who no longer feared the wind. Her cane tapped the path like punctuation. Bullet followed close behind, his ears twitching with every change in air pressure, every snap of twig. At the porch, she paused. Not to reflect, not to admire, just to listen. The silence was different now, not empty, not waiting, just full like a room after everyone leaves and the story is still echoing through the floorboards. Inside, the house remained unchanged. Same stove, same chair, same coffee pot that groaned just before it boiled. But something in the walls had shifted, not structurally, spiritually, as if the wood now recognized what had been done to preserve it. Ruth sat by the window, ledger open beside her, not to write, just to touch. The radio on the shelf hummed low, catching static, catching breath. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need more news. She had lived enough of it. And when the wind came through the screen, carrying nothing but dust and pollen, Ruth closed her eyes and whispered to no one, "I'm still watching." Then she smiled. Not for the cameras, not for legacy, just for herself. Because some women never disappear. They simply become the land. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.